Good morning, everybody. Make sure you guys follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Send me an email at andrewmarlowe22 at gmail.com if you want to talk about books or you have any questions about the channel. So we have a little bit of a sad video today. It's not all doom and gloom, but as you know, if you've been watching my videos for a while, we've talked about Marcel Proust. We've dipped our toes into In Search of Lost Time, a la recherche de temps perdu. And I'm just not feeling it. Like I've been trying to tackle Proust and I feel like I have. I feel like I've given Proust a good opportunity, a good reading, a fair chance. We've read about 2.5 volumes of a la recherche de temps perdu, and just sort of in recently, where I would say maybe on page 400 of the Gourmandist Way, maybe not quite, maybe 350 pages. And although I enjoy his writing, I love Proust's writing. It's if I could take Proust's essence, the style of his writing, and some of his rhetoric, and sort of put it in a different author's universe, like, I don't know, Thomas Wolfe, Leo Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Charles Bukowski. If I could take Proust's style and his sort of aesthetic and some of the things he talks about and just put it in a different universe that wasn't so god darn boring, I would love to do that. Maybe with AI you could do something like that. And the reason I'm making this video is not to just make a crappy video about Proust, because Proust is an important writer. He's a beautiful writer. And I'm hoping that somebody out there can sort of re-encourage me to finish A la recherche de temps perdu. I have, the whole series up there on my top shelf, as you can see, right over there. And, like everybody, I think when I first read Swann's Way, I was kind of seduced by Proust's sort of, I don't know, introspective rhetoric on memory and the Madeleine being dipped into the teacup and sort of the cool references to art and plays and philosophy. And he does have a lot of clever things going on, but his subject matter and his character arcs, to me, are just not entertaining. They're not relatable. And I think that's partially through no fault of Proust's own, is a product of Proust's time period and his upbringing, right? I mean, he was basically a rich aristocrat that grew up with all these, grew up in a fancy lifestyle. And although some of his characters struggle, even he struggles, it's hard to sort of get to the point or understand what point Proust is really trying to get at. I think that's what's so frustrating about reading Marcel Proust, is that there's no light at the end of the tunnel that I can see that really makes it worth sort of laboring through, right? So I do think there's something to be said for at least attempting Proust, and I don't mean just reading half of Swann's Way. I mean actually reading a couple volumes, 2 or 3, maybe 4, but there's no sense in trying to force yourself to read something that just doesn't resonate with you or you don't feel is engaging. And I think I've read a lot of critics, online of Proust, or, I don't mean like professional critics, but just the regular average person that comes to Proust, is that we don't really find ourselves really caring about what happens to any of these characters because they don't come across as very compelling. They don't come across as maybe engaging or people that we can or should relate to. For example, Proust's obsession with Gilberte in the beginning of Swann's Way. We don't really care if he ends up being with Gilberte, or if she ends up rejecting him or whatever. And I think there's sort of a duality in Proust where we have this really, even Kazuo Ishiguro said it really, really well, that every once in a while Proust has these really beautiful introspective passages that's, sort of fixate on memory and the passage of time and sort of the aesthetic that Proust was influenced by, of this sort of this retrospective meditation through literature, I guess you could say. We could go down a whole rabbit hole of Proust's influences. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the video. But like Ishiguro said, you have to labor through, you might get a really brilliant passage, and then you're going to have to labor through 400 pages or whatever it is, 200 pages of this really boring sort of cultural conversations, these cultural exchanges of these elite French people in this French society around the turn of the century, that being the early 1900s, that the average person is just not interested in. And I think every once in a while, sort of with Proust too, you feel like you're being tricked because he does have these beautiful passages, like Ishiguro says, and then he'll sort of throw out these really cool art references. He'll say, like, the way the wind blew on the side of the building reminded me, or the way the light reflected on the side of the church or the building reminded me of the paintings of, I don't know, Turner or whoever. And you'll think, oh, this guy's pretty educated. He knows all this, cultural art stuff. He's referencing all these poems and plays and philosophies and paintings. But he doesn't really go anywhere with it, in my opinion. I mean, I've heavily annotated Proust. I used to have sticky notes sticking out of Swan's Way. We still got our sticky notes sticking out of Within a Budding Grove. And so it's not to say he's not stimulating or you can't get something out of him, but I guess what I'm trying to say is whenever I'm reading Proust, I just have this insatiable boredom. I mean, I do like parts of like what he writes about. I like some of his characters. I like some of his conversations. And like I said, I love the style of his writing, and I think it's influential. Dare I say a little bit too much. When you first come to Proust, there's a temptation to write like Proust, and you have to kind of, stop and say, hey, that's already been done, but you can take little influences from Proust, sure. But there's this insatiable boredom that comes from reading Proust, I think, in my opinion. Sure, some parts of it are relaxing and but you're not supposed to sit there and just be bored to tears and frustrated with stuff that you read. And for me, that's kind of what Proust is. And in addition to the sort of insatiable boredom is this sense that I should be reading or I could be reading so many other things. And that's what I want to do. I want to keep reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Faulkner and Thomas Wolfe and Hemingway and, John Steinbeck and David Foster Wallace and all the other great masters that we have, Charles Dickens that we have on our bookshelf, the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen, all the master and mastresses, I guess we could say, of literature that for me currently are not Proust. But if there's any Proust aficionados out there that are super passionate about Proust that maybe feel like I'm missing something, let me know. But I think it could just be the fact that I just don't resonate with it. To me, it's boring. And there were some other things that I wanted to sort of delve into. As far as his interesting references to art and the theater and the reactions that he gets, from these different art galleries or plays or concerts that he goes to. Sure, it's interesting, but like I said, he doesn't really go anywhere with it. To me, it doesn't really, other than sort of this character, Proust, the narrator, sort of recalling what these things remind him of, it doesn't really serve that much of a purpose other than for him to sort of maybe suggest that he's well educated or he's well cultured or something. So as a writer, you want to be careful when you just kind of throw out different references to things. You want it to sort of inform the character arc, right? Or you want it to inform something aesthetically within the poem or the novel that you're writing, and not just be like sort of this long tangent list of different things just so people might think you're culturally, enriched or something. I don't know. And I'm not saying that was Proust's intention. So we've been bashing a little bit on Proust, but, I do love his writing, and maybe there's something else that Proust wrote. I mean, this is primarily what he wrote was A la Recherche de Temps Perdus. We don't have a lot of other things to choose from, but to me, it's just not worth sitting through, 6 or 7 volumes of like 5, 6, 7, 800 pages. To me, like there's so many other things I'd rather read. I want to read Dostoevsky and, all these great writers that we've talked about, Victor Hugo. I mean, Les Miserables is a masterpiece compared to, A la Recherche de Temps Perdus. In its own way, I'm not discrediting Marcel Proust. I mean, he obviously he influenced a whole generation of writers, and he was, we have Proust for a reason, because around that turn of the century where Proust was kind of coming up, they had, Freud, and we had this sort of psychological, therapeutic, movement that sort of influenced writers. And, I'm sort of reading off of the list here that I found in this article, but obviously Proust was responding to a lot of different writers, and maybe he didn't want to go in the same sort of chaotic direction, depressing, nihilistic direction of Dostoevsky, and maybe he didn't want to tackle sort of the social tensions of, Tolstoy in the same way. But, obviously he was influenced by John Ruskin, and, obviously some other French writers like Balzac, perhaps, Emile Botreau, Gabriel Cielis, Victor Egger, and sort of the German movement known as the German idealist that sort of dealt with similar themes that Proust dealt with. But he was also fascinated by art criticism, like somebody like John Ruskin, like we mentioned. And I think Proust was sort of trying to do something like art criticism in the guise of a novel, and to me it just doesn't quite work. I mean, I like his references, I like his his vast knowledge of the history of art and stuff, but it just comes across as sort of this over intellectualized privileged guy. And I don't mean to say privilege like I'm a cultural Marxist or something, but he, obviously he's Proust sort of sits in these lavish environments and goes on these tours, and he develops these sort of childish obsessions with women or men or actors and actresses. And to me, it's maybe a little too self-indulgent, and there's not much of a character arc that I'm really seeing. Maybe there's some reward, at the, I don't know, the 10th volume of A la Recherche de Temps Perdu, the 6th or 7th volume, however many there are. But in general, it seems like a terrible bore, and there's so many other things I want to read. So I usually don't make harsh critical videos like this, to this extent, totally saying we're not going to read this writer anymore. And there's been other writers that I'm not particularly thrilled with, that I don't quite understand the hype. Kind of like Faulkner. To me, Faulkner is very frustrating, a little bit overrated. And I think Proust is kind of in that category. But let me know if we have any Marcel Proust fans that have completed A la Recherche de Temps Perdu. Please let me know why it's worth finishing. How do you get past that boredom? How do you get past that feeling that this is just, I can't relate to this, this is boring? Is there another author similar to Proust that I might enjoy? Let me know. So thank you so much for joining us here on In-Depth Literature. I'm going to get this video up for y'all, and you guys can let me know what else Proust wrote. I don't think he wrote much else, maybe some political essays or something. And like I said, you do have some interesting comments on culture and class and psychology and therapy and stuff that comes up in Proust. And I remember that somebody a long time ago left me a pretty interesting critical comment of Proust that sort of suggested that there's much more to Marcel Proust than just dipping the Madeleine in the teacup and getting this sort of retrospective memory. But I just can't tell what the heck he's really getting at. And maybe it's something that gets lost in translation as well. But he takes, way too long, in my opinion, to describe something. And these pages just go on and on and on and on for volume after volume after volume. And I just cannot see myself committing, another 5 years, however long it would take me, probably not even that long, because Proust, he's pretty easy to read. It's not that it's difficult, but you'll read like a whole chapter of Proust, or you'll read like a whole book of Proust, and you just can't really recall what the heck it was about. You might remember little highlights and stuff like that, but to me, there's not much of a story that there really to be remembered, other than Proust is little. He's a child. He's obsessed with the goodnight kiss from his mother, and then he sort of grows up and he dips, the Madeleine into his teacup, and then he remembers all these things from his childhood, and he likes art and he likes music, and he's obsessed with Mademoiselle de Guamantes, and he's obsessed with Gilberte, and he's obsessed with Phaedre, some actress, or I think that's her name. Maybe that's a character she played. I can't remember. And he's obsessed with all these other, men, and then eventually I think he starts to go into the homosexual exploration of his personality, which may be interesting, but to me, there's just not enough there it's just too much of a commitment for something that's not very rewarding. So that's pretty much my little short take on Marcel Proust. And who knows? I don't plan on throwing away A la Recherche de Temps Perdus. I do plan on keeping them. Maybe we'll try to read some more articles, some more critical reviews of it. But to me, it's just not enough of a story there. There's not enough to relate to. There's not enough character arcs, and I don't find myself caring about any of these characters. And maybe that's not the point of A la Recherche de Temps Perdus. So maybe I'm, sort of getting, maybe the way I'm reacting to it is wrong, and I'm totally missing the point. But let me know in the comment section, and we'll talk to you all next time.